The door closed behind her, and that was that. She was 14 years old. The door was made of oak, bound in iron, and it weighed more than she did. When it closed, it made a sound that she would spend the rest of her life, the next 67 years, as it turned out, occasionally hearing in her head at quiet moments the specific resonance of the iron latch dropping into place. She did not cry. She was a bishop's daughter, and she had been told, since she was old enough to be told things, that crying about the things you could not change was a waste of water. She stood in the courtyard of the Abbey of St. Hildegard with the sound of the closed door in her ears, and she looked at the stone buildings and the enclosed garden and the nuns watching her from a respectful distance, and she did not cry. She thought, "I will learn everything here." She was not wrong. Welcome to Dull Tales. Tonight we're going somewhere quieter than usual. No cannon fire, no cattle cars, no floods. Tonight we go behind the walls of the medieval convent, into the enclosed world of the medieval religious woman, which is one of the most misunderstood spaces in all of medieval history. The popular image of the medieval nun is passive, obedient, cut off from the world, perhaps a little sad. A woman who had no choice. A woman whose life was reduced to prayer and silence. That image is wrong. Or at least, it is so incomplete as to be misleading. The reality of women's monastic life in medieval Europe was stranger and more complicated and more interesting than the popular image allows for. The medieval convent was a place where women ran institutions, governed communities, conducted correspondence with popes and emperors, produced books, composed music, practiced medicine, managed estates, and occasionally told bishops what to do. It was also, yes, a place where some women were imprisoned against their will. Both things were true. They were true at the same time. The contradiction between them is part of what makes the history interesting. Before we go in, the usual. Subscribe if Dull Tales is your late-night company. Leave a comment. Tell me where you're listening from. And if you have a particular interest in women's history or medieval history or both, this one's for you. Let me ask you a few things before we begin. Did medieval nuns take a vow of silence? The full, absolute, talking is forbidden vow of silence? Or is that mostly a story? What happened when a woman who had been put in a convent against her will decided she didn't want to stay? How did the abbess of a major medieval convent manage the finances and the politics and the ecclesiastical relationships of an institution that might control significant amounts of land and employ significant numbers of people? Did medieval convents produce literature, not just copies of existing texts, original literature, written by women? What was the daily schedule of a medieval religious woman, from the first bell before dawn to the last prayer at night? And the question nobody asks, what did the medieval convent smell like? Not in the romantic incense and candles way, in the actual way. Tonight we find out. Congratulations! You've just woken up in a Benedictine abbey in the Rhineland in the year 1150. It is before dawn. The bell is ringing. You have approximately 45 seconds to get out of bed before the person sleeping next to you on the dormitory platform is already on her feet and moving toward the door. Move! Let me start with the bell. The medieval convent's day was organized around the divine office, the cycle of 8 daily prayer services that structured the religious day from before dawn to after dark, and sometimes into the middle of the night. The office was not optional. It was not adjustable. It was the primary obligation of the religious life, the daily performance of prayer that the monastery or convent existed to provide. The 8 hours of the office, in their traditional form. Matins in the middle of the night between midnight and 4 a.m. depending on the season. This was the longest service, with psalms, readings, and responses that could take an hour or more. Lauds before or at dawn, as the light was beginning. Prime at sunrise. Terce at the 3rd hour, roughly mid-morning. Sext at noon. None at the 9th hour, roughly mid-afternoon. Vespers at sunset. Compline after sunset, the final prayer of the day before the great silence of the night. 8 prayer services. In every 24 hours. Some of them in the middle of the night. This schedule was the architecture of the medieval religious woman's existence. Everything else, work, study, meals, administration, correspondence, the management of the estate, the reception of visitors, the education of the oblates, happened in the spaces between the office. The bell that rang for each of these hours was not a suggestion. You got up when the bell rang. You went to choir when the bell rang. You prayed when you were in choir, and you returned to whatever you had been doing when the service ended. The rhythm of this, sustained over decades, created a specific relationship with time that is unlike anything in the modern experience. The day was not a continuous flow to be managed. It was a series of segments, each ending and beginning with the movement toward prayer, the accumulation of 8 daily encounters with the sacred interrupting and structuring everything else. People who have spent time in communities that still observe the full divine office describe the effect on time perception as significant. The day feels both shorter and more spacious. The interruptions prevent the kind of deep absorption that makes time disappear. You are always aware at some level of where you are in the cycle. Whether this was experienced as a gift or an imposition probably depended on the person. For Hildegard, the girl who came through the oak door at 14, who is now 35 and who has been in this community for 21 years, and who is beginning to have the visions that will eventually make her famous, the office was simply the rhythm she had always lived in. She did not know another kind of day. The bells were as natural to her as the sunrise. The bell rang. She was already awake. Let me tell you about the dormitory. The sleeping arrangements of the medieval monastery or convent were communal by design and by theology. Private rooms for sleeping were associated with comfort and wealth and the pleasures of the world, which the religious life was supposed to renounce. You slept together, in a long room with the other sisters, on a platform divided into individual spaces by curtains or simply by convention. You were never entirely alone. This was the point. The communal life, the shared meals, the shared prayer, the shared work, the shared sleeping, was the form that the religious ideal took in practice. The community was the unit of the religious life, not the individual. You were Sister so-and-so of the Abbey of St. Hildegard, not a private person who happened to live here. This had specific practical consequences. You could not have a private conversation of any length without it being potentially observed. You could not spend an evening alone. You could not have a crisis without the community knowing about it at some level, because the community was always there. For some people, this was unbearable. For some people, it was the specific form of belonging they had needed their whole lives. For most people, it was simply the condition of their existence, neither entirely comfortable nor entirely uncomfortable, the specific texture of the life they had. Hildegard had a particular friendship with a woman named Richardis von Stade, who was approximately 20 years younger than her and who had entered the community as a child. The nature of this friendship, its warmth, its intensity, the specific pain of its eventual disruption when Richardis was appointed to lead another community, is documented in the letters that both women wrote and that survive. The letters are among the most emotionally intense surviving documents of medieval women's experience. They speak of grief at separation, of the specific pain of loving someone within the constraints of the communal religious life, of the complicated management of attachment and duty. They are, on any honest reading, love letters. Whether they were more than that in the physical sense is a question that the sources do not answer definitively, and that historians have debated. What is clear is that within the constrained social world of the medieval convent, deep attachments formed, and those attachments were the specific human content of the religious life, alongside and intertwined with the spiritual. Let me now give you a different figure. Let me give you not the great mystic but the administrator. Her name was Agnes. She was the abbess of a Benedictine house in the East Midlands of England, and she had been running the place since 1186, when she was elected by the community of her sisters to take on the role that nobody else wanted. Nobody wanted it because the abbey's finances were, in 1186, a disaster. A previous abbess had made several poor decisions about borrowing money from Jewish moneylenders at rates that had not been adequately thought through, and the resulting debt was secured against several of the abbey's best properties, and the moneylenders were beginning to press for repayment. Agnes, who was 42 years old and had been in the abbey since she was 7, and had developed, over 35 years of close observation, a fairly precise understanding of how institutions work and how they fail, took the job. She spent the first year doing what any competent institutional administrator does when taking over a financial disaster. She understood exactly how bad it was. She read all the documents. She visited all the properties. She talked to all the creditors. She assessed what was real and what was overstated and what might be negotiated. Then she began fixing it. The specific methods available to a medieval abbess managing institutional debt were not dramatically different in their logic from the methods available to a modern institutional administrator in a similar situation. You identify what can be sold, what can be renegotiated, what can be increased in productivity, and what can be reduced in cost. You make those changes. You sustain them until the situation improves. Agnes sold a small parcel of land that had been producing minimal income and whose sale eliminated a significant portion of the most punitive debt. She renegotiated the terms of the remaining borrowing. She improved the management of the abbey's substantial grain production by changing how the harvest was organized and stored. She reduced expenditure in several areas where spending had been occurring without commensurate value. By 1195, the abbey's finances were stable. By 1200, they were better than they had been before the crisis. Agnes did not receive a bonus or a promotion. She continued being the abbess. She continued waking up when the bell rang for matins. She continued going to choir 8 times a day. She also continued running one of the most well-managed ecclesiastical institutions in her diocese. The bishop knew it. He relied on her judgment in administrative matters that extended beyond the abbey's walls. The other institutions in the region knew it. Agnes was consulted, formally and informally, about property management and financial arrangements by people who understood that she was very good at what she did. She did not publish her methods. She did not write a manual. She ran the abbey and the knowledge stayed in her head and was passed on incompletely to the sister she trained as her successor. This is how most institutional knowledge has always been transmitted. Let me tell you about education. Because the medieval convent was, among its other functions, an educational institution, and the education it provided was one of the few forms of sustained intellectual development available to women in the medieval world. The cathedral schools and the early universities of the 12th century were for men. Women were not admitted. The clergy, which was the primary educated class in medieval Europe, was male. The secular courts provided some intellectual life for women of the high nobility, but this was variable and dependent on individual circumstances. The convent was different. A girl who entered a convent received, over the years of her religious formation, a systematic education in Latin, in the reading and interpretation of scripture and patristic texts, in music and chant, and in the practical knowledge necessary for the religious life and for the management of the institution. This education was not equal to what men received in the same period. It was not equivalent to the systematic philosophical and theological training of the cathedral schools. but it was real, and it was sustained, and it was in many cases the most thorough intellectual formation available to a woman. The oblates, the children given to monasteries and convents by their families, sometimes as young as 5 or 6, received this formation from childhood. A woman who had been in a convent since age 7 and had spent 35 years reading, studying, copying texts, participating in the intellectual life of the community, had by any reasonable standard received a substantial education. What she did with it depended on her specific gifts and her specific circumstances. Some women became copyists and illuminators, the scribes who reproduced the manuscripts on which the transmission of ancient and medieval learning depended. The scriptorium, where the copying was done, was one of the convent's important spaces, and the work done there was important work, the preservation and transmission of texts that would otherwise be lost. Some women became composers. The office required music-specific chants for specific seasons and occasions, and some religious communities developed their own distinctive musical traditions, composed by members of the community. Hildegard composed music. A substantial body of it survives. It is distinctive in ways that musicologists still find notable. Her compositional style does not conform exactly to the conventions of her time. The melodic range is wider, the specific quality of the sound different from the standard chant repertoire. Some women wrote, and here the story becomes remarkable. Let me take a small detour to tell you about Hildegard of Bingen specifically, because she is the most extraordinary figure in the women's monastic tradition of the medieval period, and she cannot be reduced to a footnote. Hildegard was born in 1098. She entered the convent at approximately age 14, as we have already noted. She eventually became abbess of the community that became the Abbey of St. Hildegard near Bingen on the Rhine. She died in 1179 at the age of approximately 81. In between, she wrote 3 major works of visionary theology, civias, the Book of Life's Merits, and the Book of Divine Works. She wrote a natural history and a medical text. She composed the Ordo Virtutum, an early example of morality drama, and approximately 77 songs that constitute one of the largest surviving bodies of medieval musical composition by a single named author. She also conducted an extensive correspondence with popes, emperors, abbots, abbesses, and various other people who sought her opinion on matters spiritual and practical. Her letters, nearly 400 survive, constitute a remarkable record of an active intellectual and spiritual life engaged with the problems of her world. She also, at one point, went on preaching tour. This is notable because preaching was a male function in the medieval church. Women did not preach. The prohibition was clear and enforced. Hildegard did it anyway. She did it on the basis that her visions were not her own opinions, but divine communications that she was obligated to transmit. The authority for what she said came from God, not from her own human authority, which meant the prohibition on women speaking in the church's official capacity was technically not being violated. This was a very clever argument. It was also, probably, an argument she believed. The visions were real to her in the most fundamental sense, not rhetorical devices but actual experiences that she described in specific sensory detail across her lifetime. The argument allowed her to do something women were not supposed to do, in a framework that the authorities of the church could not easily condemn, without also condemning the authority of the divine visions themselves. The bishops and popes she corresponded with, including Bernard of Clairvaux, who examined her visions and declared them authentic, had, in approving her work, limited their own ability to silence her. She was, by any assessment, one of the most remarkable people in the 12th century. She was also, for most of her life, a woman who woke up when the bell rang and went to choir 8 times a day and ate in the refectory and went to bed in the communal dormitory. The extraordinary and the ordinary coexisted in the same daily schedule. This is always true. Let me now take you to someone who did not choose to be there. Her name was Eleanor. She was 20 years old. She was the daughter of a minor nobleman who had died in debt and whose remaining assets, after the creditors were satisfied, were insufficient to provide a marriage dowry adequate for a woman of her family's status. The options available to a 20-year-old woman of minor nobility in England in the year 1210, without a dowry, were limited. The most plausible of the limited options was the convent. Eleanor did not choose the convent. She did not want the convent. She went to the convent because it was the available option for a woman in her specific circumstances, in the specific social and economic system of her specific historical moment. This is not unusual. It was not even primarily considered unfortunate in its time. The convent was understood as an honorable and spiritually valuable life, and many families considered it a reasonable and even desirable outcome for a daughter they could not otherwise adequately provide for. The women who went to the convent under these circumstances were not, in the understanding of their families, being punished. They were being settled. Whether the women themselves experienced it as settling depended on the woman. Eleanor, arriving at the priory of St. Catherine with her small chest of possessions and her lack of enthusiasm, was not yet a nun. She was a novice, on trial, in the probationary period that preceded formal vows, learning the customs and the schedule and the community. The novitiate was designed, partly, to give women time to determine whether they had a genuine vocation. The formal vows were serious commitments, and the Church, in its various documents on the monastic life, was clear that vows should be taken freely. In practice, a woman who entered as a novice and then decided she did not wish to take vows was in a difficult position. Where would she go? What would she do? The circumstances that had brought her to the convent had not changed. The alternative was still no better dowry, still no prospect of marriage, still the specific narrowness of options available to a propertyless woman in the early 13th century. Many women took the vows anyway. Not because they were forced, not in the immediate sense of being physically compelled, but because the only available alternative was worse. Eleanor took the vows. She as 21 when she took them. She was 47 when she died, still in the priory, having spent 26 years there. In those 26 years she had become, by all accounts, a skilled herbalist whose knowledge of medicinal plants was consulted by people from the surrounding area. She had become the person the other nuns went to when they were sick, the specific combination of medical knowledge and human attention that the community's health depended on. She had also become, in the specific way that people become things they did not plan, someone who loved the garden. The priory's kitchen garden and herb garden were primarily her province in the latter part of her life. She managed them with an attention that went beyond the practical. She knew each plant's specific requirements. She had opinions about companion planting that were based on decades of observation rather than any text. She had a particular fondness for certain plants that she would have been hard-pressed to justify, but that she maintained anyway. She had not wanted to be there. She came to love the garden. Whether she was happy is a question that the sources do not allow us to answer definitively, because the sources from this period, the limited documentation of individual nuns' inner lives, rarely provide that information directly. What we can say is that she was a person in a life that was not her first choice, who found within that life specific things that were hers and that she valued. This is a recognizable human situation. It is not unique to the medieval convent. Let me tell you about the meal. The refectory, the dining room, was one of the important communal spaces of the medieval convent, and meals were conducted with a specific combination of physical sustenance and spiritual content. That is one of the more distinctive features of the religious life. Meals were eaten in silence. Or rather, The nuns ate in silence while one of the sisters read aloud from a spiritual text. The combination of eating and listening was designed to prevent the meal from being simply a physical occasion. The body was fed, while the mind was engaged with something above the physical. In practice, this meant that every meal in the medieval convent was accompanied by a reader, and the reader read what the community's schedule or the abbess's direction specified. Scripture, the writings of the Church Fathers, the Rule of St. Benedict, the foundational document of Benedictine monasticism, accounts of the lives of the saints, occasionally, in more intellectually active communities, other texts. This was a significant amount of reading over the course of a lifetime. A woman who had been eating in the refectory for 40 years had, over those 40 years, heard a very large number of texts read aloud. Not all of them with equal attention. The human mind during a meal wanders in its own directions regardless of what is being read, but with some degree of accumulated exposure. The no-talking rule was managed with an elaborate system of signs, hand gestures that indicated common needs and requests. Pass the bread. I need more water. The salt, please. This sign language was specific to the monastic institution and was one of the things novices learned in their probationary period. The food itself was not designed to be pleasurable. Fasting was a significant feature of the medieval religious calendar, and the days on which fasting was observed, Advent, Lent, Fridays, and various other occasions, outnumbered the days on which the full diet was available. The full diet was vegetarian by default, with fish on permitted days and meat extremely rare or absent. This was not a form of deprivation in the context of the medieval poor, for whom meat was also rare. But for women who came from noble families, it was a specific form of the renunciation that the religious life demanded. Some women found the dietary restrictions genuinely difficult. Some women found, over time, that the simple food was one of the things they preferred about the life. That eating without the pressures of noble table culture, without the elaborate performance of aristocratic dining, without the food's function as a display of status and wealth, was its own form of relief. Agnes, the administrator abbess, had opinions about the refectory food that she expressed nowhere formally, but that the surviving accounts of people who knew her suggest were fairly pointed. She thought the bread was too hard, and the soup too thin, and the fish on Fridays of a quality that reflected poorly on the supplier's sense of what the community deserved. She did something about the fish supplier. This is the specific advantage of being the abbess. When you have opinions about institutional quality, you can act on them. Let me now tell you about the scriptorium. The scriptorium, the writing room, was one of the most intellectually significant spaces in the medieval convent. And its significance for the history of human knowledge is difficult to overstate. In the period before the printing press, the only way text was transmitted was by copying it. Manuscripts reproduced by hand. Each copy was the work of a scribe who sat in the scriptorium with a sheet of vellum, scraped and prepared animal skin, and a quill, pen, and ink and the original text to copy from, and who reproduced it word by word, letter by letter, over days and weeks. This was tedious. It was also essential. The texts that survive from ancient and medieval periods survive because scribes copied them. The texts that were not copied, or whose copies were subsequently lost, are gone. The survival of specific texts, Cicero's letters, Tacitus's histories, the works of Greek philosophers, the writings of the Church Fathers, depended on specific people in specific places deciding to copy them. Many of those specific people were women. In the great intellectual centers of early medieval Europe, the monasteries of Ireland and England and the Rhineland, women's communities contributed significantly to the transmission of learning. The manuscripts produced in women's scriptoria are recognizable by their specific styles and survive in library collections across Europe. The work of copying was not always the transmission of existing texts. Some of what was produced in the medieval scriptorium was original, the letters and treatises and visionary accounts written by the women themselves, the texts that give us direct access to medieval women's intellectual and spiritual lives. Hildegard dictated her visions to a monk who served as her scribe, then reviewed and revised his work. The collaboration between the visionary and the scribe is documented in the texts themselves. There are passages where you can hear Hildegard's own voice correcting the formulation. Other women wrote directly. The tradition of women's theological writing in the medieval period, Julian of Norwich's revelations of divine love, Methodical of Magdeburg's flowing light of the Godhead, the writings of Hildegard of Brabant, the accounts of the mystical tradition of the Low Countries, represents one of the most distinctive and underread bodies of medieval literature. These women were not producing minor works or women's literature in some diminished sense. Julian of Norwich's Revelations, written in the late 14th century, contains one of the most original and sustained theological arguments in the medieval period. The argument that God's love is maternal as well as paternal, that the suffering of Christ is an expression of motherly care, that the divine is not exclusively or even primarily masculine in its nature. She worked this argument out across a text that she wrote, revised, and expanded over 20 years. She was an anchoress, not a nun. She was enclosed in a cell attached to a church, not a member of a community, but her intellectual situation was not entirely different. She had a room, a window to the outside world where people could bring her questions, an extensive interior life that she was both experiencing and analyzing. She wrote it down. The writing was the work. Let me now give you the specific sound of the convent at night. Because the medieval convent had a specific acoustic character that deserves its own moment. After Compline, the last prayer of the day, the great silence descended. This was the period from Compline until after Lauds the following morning in which no talking was permitted. The silence was total and was enforced. The great silence in a large convent of 50 or 60 women in a stone building with a courtyard had a specific quality. The ambient sounds that remained were the sound of breathing, of footsteps on stone, of the wind outside, of rain when it rained, of the fire if there was a fire going somewhere, of the night birds. And the bells. The bells for matins came in the middle of the night, between midnight and 2 a.m. depending on the season and the custom of the house. And when the bell rang, the 50 or 60 women got up from their straw mattresses and their blankets and moved in the darkness toward the choir. The movement in the darkness. The shuffle of feet on cold stone. The specific half-asleep state of people being asked to pray before they were fully conscious. The voices entering the chant. At first, in the first minutes of matins, the voices would be rough with sleep, the specific flatness of vocal cords not yet warmed, the eyes still adjusted to darkness, the mind still in the territory between sleep and full waking. Then the chant would settle, the voices would warm, the acoustic of the stone choir would take the voices and hold them, and the quality of the sound in the space would become what it became. The matins chant in a medieval stone choir in the middle of the night is one of the sounds we can no longer hear. We know it was beautiful. We know it was regular. We know that the women who produced it were not fully awake. We know that some of them, over the decades, came to love this specific sound and this specific time of night in a way that they could not entirely explain. The specific combination of darkness and cold and communal prayer in the hours when the world was at its most still. Some of them would say later that this was when God was most present. Some of them would say it matter-of-factly, as simple description. Some of them would not say it at all, because it was too interior for words. Let me give you the mystical tradition. Because any account of the medieval convent that stays entirely in the practical realm, the finances, the schedule, the food, misses the thing that made the whole enterprise what it was. The medieval convent was a community organized around a specific goal, closeness to God, not as an abstract theological concept, as a practical aspiration pursued through specific daily practices, the accumulation of which was supposed to produce, in the receptive individual, specific experiences. The mystical tradition in medieval Christianity, the tradition of direct experiential encounter with the divine, was primarily a women's tradition, in the sense that the most significant mystical writers and practitioners of the medieval period were disproportionately women. Hildegard, Julian, Metzthilde, Hedwig, Catherine of Siena, Teresa of Avila, who is technically early modern but stands in this tradition. The great Christian mystical tradition is substantially a women's tradition. Why? This is a question that historians have approached from several directions. One answer: the mystical experience was a form of authority that was available to women in ways that official ecclesiastical authority was not. A woman could not be a priest. A woman could not be a bishop. A woman could not teach theology in a university. But a woman could receive visions. And a woman who received visions, and whose visions were authenticated by the church, had a form of authority that was in some ways harder to challenge than official institutional authority. The vision was from God. To question it was to question God. Hildegard used this. Julian used it. Catherine of Siena used it so aggressively. She wrote letters to the Pope telling him to stop being a coward and return to Rome from Avignon, that even sympathetic historians find her a bit much. She was telling the Pope to grow a backbone, because God had told her to. The Pope listened. Another answer: the specific form of the religious life available to women, the contemplative life, the life of prayer and inner attention, was structurally more conducive to the development of the mystical experience than the active institutional life available to male clergy. The parish priest, the university professor, the bishop managing his diocese, these roles directed attention outward. The contemplative in the convent, spending 8 hours a day in prayer and the rest of the time in the specific disciplines of the interior life, was directing attention inward, and the inward direction sustained over decades produced specific results. Whether those results were what the mystics described them as genuine encounters with the divine, or whether they were specific states of consciousness produced by sustained meditative practice, is a question that requires you to have a position on theology before you can answer it. What is clear is that the experiences were real, were genuine, were described with the specific detail and conviction of people who were not making things up, and that they produced, in the women who had them, a specific form of authority and a specific body of writing that is one of the most extraordinary achievements of medieval intellectual culture. Let me now give you the political nun. Because the medieval convent was not only a spiritual retreat, it was embedded in the political world of the medieval aristocracy, and the women in it were often members of that aristocracy, with the connections and the interests and the family politics that aristocratic connections and interests always involve. The abbess of a major medieval convent was not simply a religious figure. She was often a significant landowner in her own right. The convent controlled estates, which generated income, which meant the abbess had economic interests that intersected with the interests of the secular powers around her. She was a political actor in a world where land and the management of land was the primary form of political power. She also received visitors. The visiting of convents by family members of the nuns, by pilgrims, by the ecclesiastical hierarchy on visitation tour, by secular people seeking the nuns' prayers or their counsel, meant that the enclosure was never total. Information flowed in and out. The abbess who was well connected knew what was happening in the surrounding world, and was known in that world. Consider the abbesses of Fontevraud Abbey in France, the dual monastery founded by Robert of Arbrissel in the early 12th century, which housed both monks and nuns under the governance of an abbess. The abbesses of Fontevraud were sometimes members of the Plantagenet royal family. The tombs of Henry II of England, Eleanor of Aquitaine, and Richard I are at Fontevraud. The connection between the convent and the royal family was not incidental. It was constitutive of the institution's significance. Eleanor of Aquitaine herself, the extraordinary queen who was married to 2 kings, led a crusade, outlived most of her children, and governed 2 kingdoms at various points in her life, ended her life at Fontevraud as a nun. Sort of. She took the habit near the end of her life, in the way that many medieval noblewomen did the religious commitment in old age, after the active life was over, the specific form of the final chapter. She died at Fontevraud at age approximately 82. She is buried there. The tomb effigy shows her holding a book. The book she is holding is symbolic, but the symbolism is telling. The most politically significant woman of the 12th century, depicted in her eternal rest with a book in her hands. Let me tell you about the books, because the books matter in ways beyond their symbolic function. The libraries of medieval convents were real libraries, sometimes substantial ones. They contained the texts that the community used for its office and its lectio divina, the meditative reading that was part of the daily practice, and sometimes much more. Convent libraries are documented to have held classical texts alongside the religious ones, chronicles and histories alongside theology, works in the vernacular languages as well as Latin. The women who used these libraries were reading, not casually, with the specific engaged attention of people for whom reading was both a spiritual practice and one of the primary forms of intellectual engagement available to them. The marginalia, the notes in the margins of medieval manuscripts, sometimes give us direct evidence of a reader's engagement with a text. Medieval readers annotated, questioned, argued back. A manuscript with a woman's hand in the margins, identifiable sometimes by the specific annotations, by the occasional note in the vernacular, by the kinds of questions being asked, is evidence of a woman thinking. The thinking is permanent, in the sense that the manuscript survives. The thinker is mostly anonymous, in the sense that the marginalia rarely identify themselves. But the thinking is there. Reading the marginal annotations of an unknown medieval reader arguing with a theological point, questioning an assumption, noting a connection to another text. This is one of the most intimate encounters with the medieval past that the archive provides. Let me give you the convent's relationship to the outside world. Because the enclosure, the formal restriction on leaving the convent's precincts, was not total in most cases, and the world came in and the nuns went out in various regulated ways. The parlor, the room adjacent to the enclosure wall where nuns could speak with visitors through a grill, was the primary point of contact with the outside world. Visitors came to the parlor, family members, people seeking the nuns' prayers, local people with business with the convent. The conversation through the grill was supervised, in theory. In practice, supervision varied, and the conversations that happened in the parlor were not always the brief, spiritually focused exchanges that the rules imagined. Hildegard received visitors, including people who came from significant distances to consult with her. The fame of her visions had spread, and people with spiritual questions, with medical problems, with personal crises, made the journey to her community. She talked to them. She wrote to people she could not see. The extensive correspondence was one of the primary forms of engagement with the world beyond the enclosure. Some convents ran schools. The education of girls from the surrounding nobility was a function that women's communities performed throughout the medieval period, and the girls attending the school brought the outside world with them. Some convents ran hospitals or provided medical care to the surrounding area, which brought the sick and the poor to the convent's gate and brought the nuns into contact with the full range of human affliction. The enclosure was real, and it was regularly permeated. Both things were true. Let me now give you the exit. Because not all of the women who entered medieval convents stayed. The formal vows were supposed to be permanent. The Church's theology of religious vows held them as binding obligations before God. The practical and canonical mechanisms for leaving were complicated. But people left. Some women left by negotiation, family circumstances changed. A father or brother interceded with the relevant ecclesiastical authority. A dispensation was obtained, and the woman was released from her vows. This was unusual but not unknown. Some women left without permission. The records of medieval ecclesiastical courts contain accounts of nuns who had left their communities without dispensation, who were living secular lives, who had in some cases married, who had children. The Church's response to these departures was formally condemnatory. Apostasy from religious vows was a serious matter. The practical response was more variable. Some women were compelled to return. Some were allowed to remain in the secular world under conditions of penance. Some disappeared entirely from the record, which is its own kind of ending. The women who left without permission were making a specific calculation, that whatever they were going to outside the walls was worth the spiritual and social cost of the departure. Given the theology of the period, the genuine belief in the eternal consequences of breaking vows, this was not a trivial calculation. The women who made it had decided that their lives, as they were being lived, were not sustainable. Some of them were right. Some of them ended up in situations that were no better than what they had left. Some of them found what they were looking for. The record does not always tell us which. Let me now slow down and give you the specific sensory texture of a day in a Benedictine convent in the 12th century. Because we have been talking about the structure and the people, and the structure and the people only live through the senses. The convent smelled, not only of incense and candles, those were the smells of the chapel, which was one space among many. The kitchen smelled of the soup and the bread and the stored vegetables, and the specific persistent smell of a kitchen where large quantities of food are prepared without modern ventilation. The dormitory smelled of the women who slept there, the specific human smell of sleep, of unwashed bodies, of the coarse woolen habits that were the standard dress. The cloistered garden smelled of whatever was growing there, the herbs in the physic garden, the vegetables in the kitchen garden, the flowers if there were any, the specific damp stone smell that enclosed gardens in cool climates develop. The scriptorium smelled of vellum and ink, the specific animal parchment smell of scraped skin, the iron gall smell of the ink drying on it. The chapel smelled of incense and cold stone, and the specific smell of candle smoke that accumulates on old stone over decades of candles. The refectory during meals smelled of soup. Mostly soup. Medieval convent food was heavily soup-based. The feel of the convent was stone and cold. The stone floors, the stone walls, the specific chill that stone holds in all but the warmest seasons in Northern Europe. The warmth was the fire in the kitchen and the body heat of communal spaces, which in a community of 50 women could be significant. The feel of the woolen habit was scratchy in the specific way of unrefined wool, not the soft treated wool of modern clothing but the coarser, heavier fabric of medieval textile production. Worn over time, the habit would soften, but the itchiness of new wool against skin, particularly in summer, was a specific physical feature of the life that the records mention. The sound was the sound we have already described. The chant, the bells, the silence, the shuffle of feet on stone, and in the scriptorium the scratch of quills on vellum, and in the kitchen the sounds of food being prepared, and in the garden the sounds of tools in soil and birds and the wind. And the light, the specific quality of light in a stone medieval building, which came in through the windows in specific shafts, moved across the floor and the walls as the sun moved, illuminated the choir at specific angles at specific times of year in the way that certain important feast days coincided with specific light effects. This was the world. These were the senses of the life. Let me close by coming back to the girl who came through the oak door at 14. Hildegard of Bingen, who is now 73 years old, who has been in this community for 59 years, who has written her 3 major theological works and her music and her correspondence and her natural history, is sitting in the scriptorium in the afternoon light. She is not writing. The writing is mostly done now. She is reading Lectio Divina, the meditative reading that is part of the daily practice, and the text she is reading is one of the letters she received last month from a young woman at another convent who has been having visions and does not understand them and wants guidance. Hildegard has been in this position before. She has written back to people in this position. On many times, she knows what to say, but she reads the letter again, because reading it again, this time, she notices something she did not notice the first time. A specific detail in how the young woman describes the visual quality of what she sees, which is similar to something in her own early visions in a way that is specific enough to be worth responding to. She will write back tomorrow. She has things to say. She has spent 59 years learning things, and she is still learning things, and she still has things to say, and the correspondence continues. This is what the medieval convent was. Not a prison, not a paradise, not a simple story of willing sacrifice or unwilling imprisonment. It was a community of women, with all that communities of women contain: intelligence and politics and kindness and difficulty, and the specific human project of living together, and finding what is possible within a constrained life. Some of them built institutions. Some of them composed music. Some of them managed enormous quantities of money and land, and made those institutions run. Some of them wrote books that are still being read. Some of them loved each other. Some of them arrived without wanting to be there and found, in the garden or the scriptorium or the pre-dawn choir, something they did not expect to find. And some of them never stopped wanting to be somewhere else. They were all real. They were all specific. They were all in the same place, doing the same things in the same structure, becoming different things within it. Sleep now. The bell rang for Compline an hour ago. The great silence has descended. The dormitory is full of women breathing. The garden is dark. The scriptorium is empty. The manuscripts are on the shelves. The chants are in the air. Good night. Thank you for being here tonight. Subscribe if Dull Tales is part of your evenings. Leave a comment, tell me if you knew about Hildegard, if you knew about Julian, if this was a part of medieval history you'd never thought about. Next time, Mongol warriors. The horses, the steppes, the felt tents, and the most effective cavalry force in the history of the world, and the specific daily life of the people who were inside it. But tonight, the convent, the bells, the garden, the books. The great silence. Good night. Let me give you more of the people, because the people are what the history needs to be about. Let me give you a woman I'll call Sister Margaret, a composite of the kind of woman who appears repeatedly in the documentary record of medieval convents, enough times that she is a recognizable type, though she is not a single documented person. She was 48 years old. She had been in the convent since she was 7. She had known nothing else. The outside world, the world of marriage and households and children and commerce and court and field, was as foreign to her as the inside of the convent was to most outsiders. She was the community's infirmarian, the sister responsible for the health of the community members. This was a significant role. Medieval convents had their own infirmaries, their own herb gardens maintained for medicinal use, their own accumulated knowledge about the illnesses that specific populations of women in specific climates with specific diets were likely to develop. The infirmarian was not a physician in the formal sense. She had not studied medicine at a university. Women were not admitted to medieval medical universities. But she had something that the university-trained physicians sometimes lacked: 40 years of direct observation of specific patients in specific conditions, the empirical knowledge of what worked and what did not in the specific context of her community. She knew that the cold dormitory in winter produced respiratory problems and that specific preparations of thyme and honey reduced their severity. She knew that the fasting periods produced specific digestive complaints and that ginger was effective. She knew which sisters were prone to headaches in summer and why, and what helped. She also knew, in the intimate way of someone who has lived in close proximity to the same people for decades, which sisters were anxious, which were depressed in the winter, which had specific fears and specific vulnerabilities. The pastoral dimension of her role, the human attention that was part of the medical care, was as important as the herbal preparations. She had never left the convent. She knew everything that happened within its walls. She was, in her way, the community's memory, the institutional knowledge that had accumulated in her across 40 years, the knowledge of previous abbesses and their decisions, of disputes that had been resolved and disputes that had recurred, of the specific character of the land and the buildings, and the agreements with the surrounding estates lived in her. When she died, something would be lost. This is always true of the people who are the living repositories of institutional memory. It is especially true in institutions that do not write everything down, which is most institutions in most historical periods. She had trained a younger sister in the herbal work. She had not adequately transmitted the other knowledge, the accumulated understanding of 40 years, because that knowledge had no format that could be transferred in any reasonable period. Some of it she tried to explain. Some of it the younger sister would have to learn for herself. Some of it was gone when Margaret died. Let me tell you about the choir. The choir was the physical space in the church where the nuns sang the office, and it was organized specifically for this purpose. The nuns sat in stalls facing each other across the central aisle, in the specific arrangement that allowed them to face each other as they chanted, the two sides of the choir alternating in the antiphonal style that was the standard form of the office's chant. The stalls were carved wooden seats with misericords, hinged shelves that could be turned up to provide a small ledge for standing worshippers to lean against during the long-standing portions of the service. The misericords were often carved with small scenes, animals, figures, scenes of daily life, in the margin of the sacred space, in the tradition of the marginal grotesque that medieval craftsmen loved. The carvings are often funny. A medieval craftsman carving a small mouse stealing cheese on the underside of a choir stall was making a private joke that the sisters who leaned against it would see during the long prayers. The sacred and the comic coexisted in the physical fabric of the medieval church in a way that modern sensibility often misses. The choir during the services was lit by candles. The quality of the light, the movement of candle flame, the shadows it cast on the carved stalls and the stone walls, the specific warm quality of multiple candles in an enclosed stone space, was the visual environment of the daily prayer. The sisters who spent their working lives in this space knew it intimately. They knew exactly where the draft came from in winter, which stall had the sticky misericord, which stone of the floor was slightly elevated and had caught generations of feet. The familiarity of a space you have been in every day for 50 years is a specific form of knowledge. You do not look at it. You inhabit it. The space is part of you in the specific way that the most frequented places of your life are part of you, not consciously present, present the way breathing is present. Hildegard's choir was this for her. The specific acoustic of her choir, which she had known since she was 14, was the acoustic in which her music was heard. When she composed, She was composing for this space, for these voices, for these specific physical conditions. The music and the space were not separate. The music we have, the recordings of Hildegard's compositions made by modern ensembles in recording studios and stone churches, is not this music. It is a translation of the notes, a reconstruction from the manuscript, performed in conditions that no manuscript can fully specify. We cannot hear exactly what Hildegard heard. We can hear something. We hear it and we feel something. That something is the residue of a long-dead woman's response to the specific experience of prayer in a specific stone space in the Rhineland 800 years ago. It reached us. Let me tell you about the conversi and the lay sisters. Because the medieval convent was not a community only of the choir nuns, the women who sang the office and whose primary function was the liturgical life. It also contained women and sometimes men in other roles whose work was the practical support of the community. The lay sisters were women who had entered the convent but who had not taken the same vows as the choir nuns, who did not participate in the full office, and whose primary contribution was the physical work that kept the institution running. Cooking, cleaning, laundry, farming, the maintenance of the buildings. This work was done primarily by the lay sisters, freeing the choir nuns for the liturgical and intellectual work that was the convent's primary purpose. This division of labor had a class dimension. The choir nuns in most medieval convents came from the nobility or the upper gentry. The lay sisters came from lower social strata. The difference in religious obligations, the choir nuns singing the divine office, the lay sisters in simpler prayer, was also a difference in social status and in the specific form of the religious life available. This was not a just arrangement by most standards of evaluation. It was the arrangement that most convents operated under. Some convents attempted to minimize the class distinction. The tradition of Cistercian women's communities, in particular, emphasized a more egalitarian approach to the religious life that included the practical work in the community's activities for everyone. Most did not achieve this in practice. The lay sisters whose work maintained the convent are largely invisible in the surviving record, which documents primarily the choir nuns and their activities. Their labor was the foundation of everything else, and the records barely mention them. This is a consistent pattern in history. The people whose work makes institutions function rarely appear in the records of those institutions. The records document the official activity. The official activity depends on the unofficial labor. The official activity gets remembered. The unofficial labor does not. Let me give you one specific story that comes from the records of a medieval ecclesiastical visitation. A visitation was the official inspection of a religious house by a bishop or his representative, conducted to assess whether the community was observing its rule and living in accordance with the expectations of the church. Visitation records are some of the most valuable sources for medieval convent history, precisely because they document not the ideal but the actual, the complaints, the deviations, the specific problems of specific communities. This specific visitation was conducted at a Benedictine priory in Norfolk, England, in the year 1273. The bishop's representatives recorded what they found. What they found included a prioress who was not adequately managing the finances, a recurring problem, apparently, since the records showed previous admonitions on the same point. Two sisters who had been arguing loudly in the dormitory, a violation of the silence rules. A sister who had been in the habit of entertaining visitors in the parlor for extended periods without the supervision required by the rule. A lay sister who had been caught leaving the precinct without permission to visit her family in the nearby village. Three sisters who had been seen wearing ornaments on their habits that were not consistent with the simplicity the rule required. Apparently, There had been a fashion for decorated work on the sleeves that the rule did not endorse, and a note that the community's cat had been observed in the choir during Vespers, which someone had apparently decided was worth recording. The cat in the choir. I want to sit with the cat in the choir for a moment. The bishop's representative, conducting an official ecclesiastical inspection of a religious community, noted in the official record that a cat had been present in the choir during the evening prayer service. The note could mean various things. It could mean the cat was considered a genuine problem, a distraction from the sacred, an unseemly presence in the liturgical space. It could mean the representative, having not found anything more serious than sleeve ornaments, included it as evidence that the visit had been thorough. Or it could mean that medieval ecclesiastical bureaucracy had a sense of humor. The cat was noted. The cat does not appear in the follow-up records to have been dealt with. Let me tell you about Julian of Norwich, who is not a nun in the traditional sense but who belongs in this account. Julian was an anchoress, a form of religious life that was in some ways more extreme than the conventional convent. An anchoress was enclosed in a cell attached to a church, physically walled in, with a window to the church on one side for participation in the liturgy, and a window to the street on the other side for receiving visitors and provisions. This enclosure was permanent and was conducted through a specific ritual that included, in some forms, a funeral service. The anchoress was being understood as dying to the world and being resurrected in the cell. Julian entered her cell at some point in the late 14th century. She remained there for decades. She received visitors, through the outside window, who came to seek her counsel. These visitors are documented in the accounts of people who came to Norwich specifically to consult with the anchoress, whose reputation for wisdom had spread. She thought, and she wrote. The Revelations of Divine Love is the account of a series of visions she had in 1373 during a serious illness. She nearly died. She received the visions. She recovered. She spent the next approximately 20 years writing about them. First a short version, the account of the experience, and then a long version, the extended theological reflection on what the experience meant. The long version is one of the most interesting theological texts of the medieval period. It contains the famous sentence, "All shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well." This sentence is often quoted and often misunderstood. It is presented as simple reassurance, a piece of medieval optimism. It is not simple reassurance. It is the conclusion of a sustained theological argument about how a loving God can be reconciled with the existence of sin and suffering. Julian worked through this problem across the long version of the Revelations, with the specific precision of a careful thinker who did not want to pretend that the problem was simpler than it was. She did not want to dismiss the suffering. She did not want to pretend the reconciliation was easy. She worked through it. She arrived at the conclusion. All shall be well. She arrived at it not as a piece of wishful thinking, but as the end of an argument. And then she went back to her cell and received her next visitor. Let me now give you the community at its most communal. The feast days were the convent's counterpart to the ordinary round of the daily office. The elevated moments in the liturgical calendar, when the community celebrated together with more elaborate ceremony, better food, and sometimes specific rituals associated with the feast. Christmas in a medieval convent was not the elaborate domestic celebration of the modern holiday. It was, first, a liturgical event of the highest order, with the specific chants and prayers of the Christmas liturgy, the extra services, the elaborated ceremony. But it was also a community feast. The fasting of Advent was over. The food was better. The community ate together, in the refectory, with the reader reading something associated with the feast, and the specific quality of a community that has been fasting and praying through an extended penitential season arriving at the celebration it has been preparing for. The feast days were when the convent's music was at its most elaborate. The antiphons and sequences of the major feasts, the specific pieces composed for specific occasions, were the occasions when the musical life of the community showed its full capability. For communities with strong musical traditions, these were the performances that the year built toward. Hildegard's community in this account was singing her compositions. The women in the choir were singing music written by someone who was also in the choir. The composer and the performers were the same people. In the context of the medieval church, where most music was composed by men for performance by men, this is a specific thing worth noting. She heard her own music in her own choir. And now the ending. I want to close with the cloistered garden. Because the cloister, the enclosed garden at the center of the monastic building, surrounded by the covered walkway of the cloister arcade, was one of the most distinctive and most deliberately designed spaces in medieval architecture, and it deserves its own moment. The cloister garden was formal in some monasteries, a simple arrangement of 4 quadrants around a central well or fountain, the geometry of the garden reflecting the theological symbolism of the enclosed space as a representation of paradise. In practice, it was also a garden growing things, changing with the seasons, alive with the specific details of the natural world in an enclosed space. In winter, bare, the stone of the cloister arcade exposed, the fountain still if the water had frozen, the specific stillness of a garden in winter. In spring, the first things coming, the snowdrops the first green, the quality of the light changing. In summer, full, the scent of whatever was flowering, the lavender, the roses if there were roses, the herbs, the specific summer smell of plants in warm air in an enclosed stone space. In autumn, the smell of the dying year, the specific beauty of leaves changing color, the harvest of whatever the garden produced. The nuns walked in this garden. Not just as exercise, lectio divina was sometimes practiced in the cloister, the meditative reading done while walking, the body and the mind both engaged. The garden was a thinking space as well as a physical one. Eleanor, who loved her herb garden but never would have said so in exactly those words, walked in the cloister in the evenings before Compline. She did not read during these walks. She looked at the plants. She knew each of them. She had been watching them for 26 years. The specific way the light fell in this garden at this time of year on these particular plants was the specific light she knew. She was not in the garden she had imagined herself in when she was young. She was in this garden, this specific garden with its stone walls and its lavender and its particular quality of afternoon light. She looked at it. She was here. Sleep now. The great silence has descended. The garden is dark. The manuscripts are on the shelves. The bell for matins will come in a few hours. For now, the dormitory, the breathing, the dark. The women who made these communities, who ran them and argued in them and were imprisoned by them and discovered unexpected things in them, have been gone for centuries. The buildings, in many cases, are still standing. The manuscripts are in libraries. The music is still being performed. And the questions they were working on, how to live well, how to think clearly, how to find the divine in the daily, how to manage a community, how to love another person within the constraints of an institutional life, how to make something that will last, these questions are still alive. Still being worked on. Still not finished. Good night. Let me give you more of the year. Because the convent's year was structured not just around the daily office, but around the larger rhythms of the liturgical calendar, which turned the year into a narrative, not a repetitive circle but a story told again, differently, each time around. The liturgical year began with Advent, the 4 weeks before Christmas, a period of penitential preparation. The days were short in the northern hemisphere, and the mood of the season matched them. The fasting and the quiet and the long Advent liturgy had a specific quality of anticipation that built toward Christmas. Then Christmas, then the 12 days, then Epiphany. Then the long weeks of ordinary time through January and February, the most austere period of the year, the Siberian winter of the liturgical calendar in a sense, the weeks that tested endurance more than they invited celebration. Then Lent, 40 days of intensified fasting and prayer and penitential practice, beginning on Ash Wednesday with the marking of ashes on the forehead and the specific words, "Remember that you are dust, and to dust you shall return." Lent in a medieval convent was the period when the disciplines that the religious life always imposed were imposed more severely. Less food, more prayer, more silence. Then Holy Week, with its specific intensity, the liturgies of Palm Sunday, the tenebrae services of Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday, the specific darkness of the Good Friday service in which the altar was stripped bare, and the community contemplated the death of Christ, the Easter Vigil on Saturday night in which the Paschal candle was lit in darkness, and the community chanted its way through the night toward the dawn. Then Easter, then the joy of it, which in the context of the Lenten austerity was genuinely felt as relief and celebration. The Alleluia returned to the liturgy after having been absent through Lent. The food improved. The days were longer. Then Pentecost. Then Trinity Sunday. Then the long summer of ordinary time, which was not ordinary in the sense of dull but ordinary in the sense of the standard texture of the year. The weeks not marked by special fasts or special feasts, the regular round of the office proceeding through the summer with the specific quality of summer. Then the late summer and early autumn feast days, the feasts of various saints, the harvest celebrations. Then Advent again. The year told this way is a story. It has a structure, preparation, arrival, celebration, the ordinary deepening, the heightened intensity of Lent, the death, the resurrection, the long ordinary summer, the beginning again. The sisters who had been in the community for 20 or 30 or 40 years knew this story in their bodies as well as their minds. The specific quality of Ash Wednesday, the specific quality of Easter morning, the specific quality of Advent's quiet darkening. These were not intellectual experiences. They were embodied ones, carried in the accumulated memory of having lived through the same cycle again and again. The cycle was not repetition in the modern sense of boredom. It was repetition in the sense of a piece of music heard many times. Each time you know what is coming, and the knowing is part of the experience, the anticipation part of the joy, the memory of previous hearings layered onto the present hearing. Hildegard in her 73rd year had heard Easter 60 times. She knew what was coming when Ash Wednesday arrived. She anticipated it anyway. The anticipation was part of what 60 Easters had built. Let me tell you about the rule. The Rule of St. Benedict, the 5th century document that provided the foundational guidelines for Benedictine monasticism, was the framework within which most of the women we have been discussing lived. It specified the structure of the daily prayer, the organization of community life, the governance of the institution, the specific virtues and practices that the religious life was supposed to cultivate. It is a remarkably sensible document. This surprises people who expect medieval religious regulation to be harsh and demanding. The rule certainly imposes significant obligations. The divine office is not optional, fasting is required, community takes priority over individual preference. But within these demands, it is also gentle in its accommodations. The sick are to be given special consideration. The elderly are to be treated with respect for their age. The young are to be guided with patience. The specific character of each community member is to be taken into account by the abbot or abbess in managing the community. The rule says essentially, people are different and the wise leader knows this and manages accordingly. This is good institutional management advice. It is also, from Hildegard's perspective, one of the things that the rule got genuinely right: the individual attention, the specific care for the specific person. She wrote about this in her own works. The attention to the individual, the understanding that the spiritual life cannot be standardized to a single form that works for everyone, the diversity of charisms and temperaments, and the need to respect that diversity. These themes appear in Hildegard's writing in ways that reflect both the rule and her own observation of what made communities function and what made them fail. She was, among other things, a practitioner of institutional management in the specific way that only someone who has managed institutions learns to think about them. Let me give you a night of matins in full. Because matins is the prayer service that I have mentioned multiple times, and that deserves to be rendered fully, because it is one of the most distinctive experiences of the monastic life, and one that modern people are unlikely to have encountered. The bell rang sometime after midnight. The sisters, all of them in theory, though practice varied by health and age, rose from their straw mattresses and their woolen blankets. The dormitory was dark. There were no individual lights. You moved in the darkness using the familiarity of the space, the specific knowledge of where the edge of your sleeping platform was, where the door was, the route to the stairs. They moved in darkness down to the choir. The choir was lit, minimally, by the candles at the altar. The light was enough to see by, dimly. The carved stalls were in shadow. The faces of the sisters across the central aisle were barely visible. Then the chant began. Matins began with the invitatory, the specific psalm that opened the service, which was sung slowly, antiphonally, the two sides of the choir alternating. Then the psalms of matins, which were many, sung through with their antiphons. Then the lessons, readings from Scripture or the Church Fathers, chanted in the specific tone of the lessons. Then the responsories that followed each lesson, the elaborate chanted responses that were among the most musically complex elements of the office. In the major communities with strong choral traditions, the matins of a major feast could last an hour and a half to 2 hours. At 1 a.m. or 2 a.m. in the dark, with the specific half-asleep quality of the participants. There is something about praying in this state, the dissolution of the fully woken guard, the specific permeability of the mind in the middle of the night, the lowered defenses against whatever the prayer is accessing, that the mystical tradition has always associated with specific kinds of spiritual experience. Hildegard's visions often came in the periods between sleeping and full waking. This is probably not a coincidence. The matins experience, the darkness, the cold, the chant, the specific state of consciousness, was part of the structure of the life that produced what the life produced. After matins, the sisters returned to the dormitory and slept again until the bell for lauds. Then the day began properly. Then the bell rang for prime. And so on. 8 times. Every day. For the rest of their lives. Let me give you what people thought about when the chant was going on. Because praying 8 times a day for decades is not the same as being fully present and actively engaged 8 times a day for decades. The human mind is not designed for sustained, concentrated attention of that duration. The nuns who sang the office were not saints who maintained perfect attention throughout every service. They were human beings with the wandering attention that all human beings have. The spiritual directors of the medieval tradition were aware of this. The problem of distraction during prayer, the mind that wanders to the household accounts in the middle of sext, the mind that is composing a letter during the Vespers antiphon, the mind that is simply absent, was addressed repeatedly in spiritual writing. The standard advice was not to eliminate distraction by force of will, which was understood to be impossible. It was to notice the distraction without judgment and return to the prayer. The returning was the practice. The wandering was not failure. The returning was the prayer. Over decades, this practice, the noticing and returning, the noticing and returning, 8 times a day, every day produces specific effects in the practitioner. The specific quality of attention it develops, the specific relationship with the interior life it creates, is documented in the mystical literature as a form of transformation. Whether the transformation was spiritual or simply the result of sustained attentional practice on the brain's specific capacities is a question for your theology. What is documented is that it happened. Hildegard, who had been practicing the noticing and returning since she was 14, had developed a quality of interior attention that was extraordinary by any standard. She described it in her visions as a specific light. Let me now close in a different register. Because this episode has been, by the standards of our recent episodes, quiet, no cannon, no cattle car, no famine road. This was intentional. The medieval convent is quiet by design. The quietness was the point. The quietness was the practice. The quietness was what produced, over decades of sustained silence and prayer and attention, the conditions in which women could build institutions and write books and compose music and work out the theology of divine love in a cell in Norwich. The quietness was not passivity. It was the specific kind of activity that requires stillness. The women who built these institutions in the quiet, who worked in the silence of the scriptorium, who rose before dawn for 60 years to pray in the dark, they were not passive recipients of a life imposed on them. Some of them were, yes, Eleanor, who didn't choose to be there, the women who left without permission, the women who are in the ecclesiastical court records as apostates from their vows. But also Hildegard, who chose to stay and who built what she built, Agnes, who ran the finances and kept the institution alive, Sister Margaret, who knew her herbs and her sisters and who kept 40 years of institutional knowledge alive in her, Julian, alone in her cell, working on the argument that would conclude, all shall be well. These women were doing something. They are still doing it, in the sense that the work persists. The music is still being performed. The manuscripts are in libraries. The revelations of divine love is still being read. The Abbey of St. Hildegard, rebuilt in the 19th century on the site of the original, still an active Benedictine community, is still there. The bell still rings. The sisters still rise. The chant is still happening in a stone choir on the Rhine, 8 times a day. Good night. Let me give you the medicine. Because the medieval convent's relationship to medicine is one of the more remarkable aspects of the institution and deserves fuller treatment. The Benedictine tradition's emphasis on care for the sick, the rule specifies that care for the sick is to be placed above all else, that the abbot or abbess is to treat the sick as Christ, meant that medical care was a central function of the monastery and convent. The infirmary was a permanent part of the institution. It housed the sick of the community and, in many institutions, offered care to sick people from outside the walls. The monastic infirmary was, in many parts of medieval Europe, the primary or only institution offering consistent medical care to the sick poor. The medical knowledge in the medieval convent was a mixture of the empirical and the theoretical, the practically effective and the theologically interpreted. It drew on the ancient medical traditions transmitted through Arabic learning, the Galenic medical tradition that understood the body in terms of humors, and on the specific practical knowledge developed in the infirmary through direct observation. Hildegard's medical writings, the Physica and the Causae et Curae, are remarkable documents that have attracted significant scholarly attention. The Physica is a natural history that describes the properties of plants, animals, and stones, including their medical applications. The Causae et Curae addresses causes and cures of various conditions, organized by the humoral framework, but including specific empirical observations that go beyond the framework. Some of Hildegard's medical recommendations have been analyzed by modern pharmacologists and found to have genuine physiological effects, not the effects she attributed them to in her theological medical framework, but real effects. The plants she recommended for specific conditions often do contain compounds with the relevant biological activity. This is not surprising, given that the accumulated practical knowledge of generations of herbalists represents genuine empirical observation, even when the theoretical framework used to explain the observations is wrong. The garden that Eleanor loved was the infirmary's supply source. The plants she grew were growing because they were needed for the community's health management. Eleanor had been growing them for 26 years. She knew what worked. Let me tell you about the oblates. The oblates, children given to religious communities by their families, were a feature of medieval monastic life that modern people find difficult to assess. Children, sometimes as young as 5 or 6, were placed in monasteries and convents by their families. They were not yet capable of choosing the religious life in any meaningful sense. They were simply placed there, and the religious community became their world. The Church's official theology evolved over time in its assessment of this practice. By the high medieval period, there was increasing emphasis on the need for free consent to religious vows, which complicated the oblation of young children. But the practice persisted. The children who grew up in the convent from early childhood knew nothing else. They had no comparison point. The convent was not a place they had chosen. It was the place they had always been. It was home, in the only sense the word had for them. What this meant for their development, their sense of self, their relationship to the world, these are questions that the surviving records address inadequately. We have accounts of women who were oblated as children and who became significant figures in the medieval church. Hildegard herself was probably an oblate, placed in the care of the Anchoress Jutta von Sponheim around age 8. We also have accounts of people who resented their placement, who chafed against the life, who left when they were able. The diversity of responses is what you would expect from a practice that was applied to different children with different temperaments in different communities, with different conditions. The child Hildegard, at 8, placed in the care of Jutta von Sponheim on the Rupertsberg. What did she think? We do not know. We know what she became. The relationship between the beginning and the becoming is, as always, more complicated than either of them alone. Let me now give you the specific quality of the medieval convent's relationship to death. Because death was present in the medieval convent in ways that it is not present in most modern institutions, and this presence shaped the community's life. The sisters died. In a community that had been together for decades, the death of a member was a communal event. The community assisted in the preparation of the body, the prayers around the dying, the vigil after death, the burial in the community's cemetery. The dead were present in that cemetery. The nuns walked past it daily in many communities. The names of the dead were read aloud in the community's liturgical commemoration. The anniversary of a sister's death marked each year in the calendar. The dead were not gone. They were remembered, regularly and specifically, as part of the ongoing community. This relationship to death, the specific intimacy with mortality, the inclusion of the dead in the community's ongoing life, the regular encounter with the anniversaries of loss, is one of the things that the medieval convent's daily life maintained that the modern world has largely lost. The memento mori, the reminder of mortality, the deliberate cultivation of awareness that you will die, was not a medieval anomaly. It was a spiritual practice, considered to produce specific goods. Gratitude for the present, reduced attachment to material things, increased attention to what matters. Whether it produced these goods in practice, or whether sustained proximity to death produces anxiety and depression rather than equanimity, probably depended on the person and the community and the specific way the practice was maintained. Some people handled it well. Some people found it crushing. Most people found it both at different times. Let me give you the abbess in old age. Agnes, who had fixed the finances and managed the bishop and run the institution for 30 years, was 72 years old, and she was still the abbess. She was not as fast as she had been. The morning walk to choir took longer. She needed a stick on the ice in winter. Her memory for names had some gaps. The sister she would have trained as her successor had died 2 years ago, which was a specific grief and a practical problem simultaneously. She was still there. The community gathered around her with the specific affection and deference that institutions develop for long-serving leaders who have proven themselves in specific, documented ways. Everyone in the community knew the story of the financial crisis and how it had been managed. Everyone knew the bishop's respect for Agnes. Everyone knew that the institution was what it was partly because of specific decisions made over 3 decades. She had opinions about the current state of the finances that she expressed to the assistant who managed the accounts. Her opinions were right. The assistant had learned not to argue. She rose when the bell rang. She went to choir. She sang matins in the dark for the 10,000th time. After matins, she stayed in the choir for a while, not praying in any active sense, just sitting. The familiar darkness, the familiar cold of the tone, the smell of the old wood of the stalls, the fading candle at the altar. 30 years, more than 30 years now. She would not have said she was happy. Happiness was not the framework she would have used. She would have said, I have done what I was given to do. I have done it as well as I could. The institution is sound. The community is maintained. This is enough. She sat in the choir in the silence after matins, until the bell rang again for lauds. Then she got up. Then the day continued. And one more thing. Let me give you the specific satisfaction of understanding. Because one of the things the medieval convent provided for the women inside it, something that the life outside it, in the medieval period, often did not provide, was the specific satisfaction of work whose purpose was clear. The office, repeated 8 times daily, was not administrative busywork. It was what the community existed to do. The prayer was the purpose. The stability of a daily life organized around a clear purpose, this specific thing, at this specific time, because this is what the life is for, produced a form of orientation that the lives of many medieval women outside the convent lacked. The woman managing a noble household was managing many things with competing purposes. The woman in the convent was doing one primary thing, and doing it with the full structure of the community organized around her doing it. This is not to say the convent was better than the life outside it. It is to say that the clarity of purpose was a specific feature of the life, and that clarity, whatever the specific content, is something human beings need and often don't have. Some of the women in the convent had it. Some of them had it in the same way that anyone who has found the specific work they were made for has it. Hildegard writing, Agnes managing, Eleanor in her garden, Julian in her cell with her argument, they were all doing the specific thing they were doing. The specific thing was theirs. They were doing it fully. This is the best that can be said about any life. Good night. The great silence has descended. The dormitory is full of women breathing. The garden is dark. The manuscripts are on the shelves. The bell for matins will come. For now, the quiet. The magnificent, specific, carefully maintained quiet. Good night. Let me give you the women who resisted. Because the story of the medieval convent is not complete without the women who pushed back against the constraints of the institution, who found the gaps in the enclosure and used them, who made the life into something other than what the rules prescribed. Christina of Marquiate was a 12th-century Englishwoman who was betrothed against her will, escaped from the betrothal, hid from her family in various sheltered locations for years before eventually settling into the religious life. she had always wanted. Her biography, written by a monk who knew her, is one of the most remarkable documents of medieval women's experience. The specific texture of her resistance, the specific people who helped her, and the specific people who tried to stop her, the years of hiding in tiny spaces, the determination to not live the life that had been arranged for her. She eventually became the prioress of a small community at Markyate in Hertfordshire. She was a remarkable person. She was also, in the most practical sense, a pain in the neck to everyone who tried to arrange her life for her. This is the specific form that female autonomy took in the 12th century. Or Margery Kempe, who is slightly later, the early 15th century, and who is the first person to write an autobiography in the English language. Margery was a businesswoman, a wife, a mother of 14 children who had a profound religious conversion, and then spent the rest of her life going on pilgrimages, having mystical experiences, weeping publicly and loudly at religious services, and generally being what her contemporaries variously described as holy and as deeply annoying. She was both. She negotiated with her husband for a chaste marriage, which he eventually agreed to. She traveled to Jerusalem, to Rome, to Compostela, to Norway. She encountered Marguerite Kempe, no relation, who was a leader of the Beguine movement in the Low Countries, another fascinating institution, the Beguines, which we'll get to. Margery was not a nun. She was a laywoman with a religious life that she managed on her own terms, outside the formal institutional structure of the convent. This was also a possibility in the medieval period, and it was one that some women chose. Let me tell you about the Beguines. Because the Beguines are one of the most interesting and most underappreciated movements in medieval women's history, and they represent a third option between the convent and the secular world. The Beguines were women who chose to live a religious life, prayer, poverty, chastity, without taking formal permanent vows and without joining an established monastic order. They lived in communities called beguinages, enclosed urban neighborhoods, distinctive in their architecture, separate from the surrounding city but not cloistered. The Beguines emerged in the Low Countries and the Rhineland in the 13th century and spread across much of northern Europe. At their peak, there were thousands of beguinages containing hundreds of thousands of women. They were theologically controversial. The problem was the vows. Without permanent vows, a Beguine could leave whenever she chose. Without institutional affiliation, she was not under the authority of any religious order. Without theological oversight, her interpretation of the faith was her own. The Beguines produced some of the most original theological writers of the medieval period: Mechthild of Magdeburg, Hadewich of Brabant, Marguerite Porete, whose Mirror of Simple Souls was declared heretical and who was burned in Paris in 1310. Marguerite Porete, burned for a book. The book describes the soul's progression through 7 stages of spiritual development, culminating in a state of complete union with the divine in which the soul has no more needs and no more will because it has become fully aligned with the divine will. The theological authorities found this dangerous because it seemed to imply that the soul in this state had no need of the church, no need of the sacraments, no need of the institutional apparatus of organized Christianity. They were not entirely wrong about what it implied. She refused to recant. She was burned. The Mirror of Simple Souls was circulated anonymously for centuries after her death, attributed to unknown authors, read by readers who did not know or could not say who had written it. It reached the Low Countries and England and Italy. It influenced the mystical tradition. The author's name was eventually recovered. The burning did not erase the book. Let me give you the double monastery. Because some medieval religious institutions combined male and female communities under a single governance structure, and these dual institutions were particularly interesting for what they tell us about the specific possibilities and specific tensions of women's religious leadership. Fontevraud, which I mentioned in connection with Eleanor of Aquitaine, was founded at the beginning of the 12th century by the preacher Robert of Arbrisel. He specifically placed the community under the governance of an abbess, arguing that the men should serve the women, that the monks of the community existed to provide the liturgical and sacramental services that the nuns required, and that the women were the primary community. This was unusual enough to generate comment. Robert's theological argument was about humility. The paradox of strong men serving women was a form of voluntary humility, the monks practicing the virtue of submission. It was also, practically, a recognition that women's communities had specific spiritual and practical needs that were best met by having men available to provide them. The abbesses of Fontevraud were significant figures. They governed both the women's and the men's communities. They had authority over monks as well as nuns, which was theologically complicated in a period when the general principle held that women did not have authority over men in the ecclesiastical order. The Fontevraud abbesses exercised that authority anyway. For the centuries of the institution's existence, with the backing of the papacy, which had approved the unusual governance structure. This is one of the places where the medieval institutional record shows women exercising formal authority in ways that the general principles of the period would have said they shouldn't be doing. They did it. The institution functioned. The general principles were more flexible in practice than they were on paper. Let me now truly close. You have been in the medieval convent tonight. In the bell before dawn in the cold dormitory, and the shuffle of feet on stone in the dark. In the scriptorium with the quill and the vellum. In Agnes's account books. In Eleanor's garden. In Hildegard's choir. In Julian's cell. In Marguerite Porreet's book, which survived the burning. In the choir for matins, the voices warming in the dark. You have been with women who did not choose to be there, and who found something in the not choosing. You have been with women who stayed, and women who left, and women who fought to be there, and women who fought to get out. You have been with the cat in the choir, noted in the visitation record. These were real places full of real people doing the real work of real lives, which included prayer and finance and herb gardening and theology and friendship and grief, and the specific private experience of being a specific person in a specific constrained world who was trying to find what was possible within it. Some of them found extraordinary things. Some of them found quiet, ordinary things. All of them found something. Sleep. The bell will ring before dawn. The dormitory is breathing. The garden is dark. The manuscripts are on the shelves. Good night. Thank you for tonight. Subscribe, like, leave a comment. Tell me if you knew about Hildegard or Julian before tonight, if you've been to any surviving monastic buildings, if you've ever heard Hildegard's music. Next time, the Mongols, the steppes, the horses, the felt tents and the cuirass and the most effective cavalry force the world has ever seen, and the people inside it. But tonight was the quiet one. The convent. The great silence. Good night. One more thing, two more people. Let me give you Helice. Helice d'Argenteuil is one of the most famous women in medieval history, primarily because of her love affair with the philosopher Peter Abelard, which ended in catastrophe, Abelard's castration by Helice's uncle, their forced separation and entry into religious life. The love affair and the tragedy are well known. What is less discussed is what came after. Helice became a nun, then a prioress, then the abbess of the Paraclete, a religious house that Abelard had founded, and that became, under her governance, a significant institution. She corresponded extensively with Abelard and with Bernard of Clairvaux and with other intellectual figures of the period. She wrote, in Latin, with a precision and fluency that her contemporaries recognized as extraordinary. The letters between Helis and Abelard, which survive and which are among the most read documents of the medieval period, are, on the surface, the correspondence between a former lover and the man who loved her, a woman who chose religious life against her will and the man for whose sake she chose it. They are also, on closer reading, something more complex, the letters of a woman who is engaged in a genuine intellectual and spiritual reckoning with her life, who is not simply grieving the lost lover, but working out the specific question of how to live with integrity in the specific life she has. She loved Abelard. She said so directly, in terms that have embarrassed some of her later editors. She was also, by any assessment, one of the most capable institutional leaders of her century. She was both of these things, at the same time, in the same institution, every day, for the rest of her life. And let me give you one more woman who is entirely outside the institutional framework. Hildegard von Bingen, at 78 years old, is dying. Her community had fallen under ecclesiastical interdict, a suspension of liturgical services, as a result of a dispute about whether she had allowed a man who had been excommunicated to be buried in the community's cemetery. The man had been reconciled to the church before his death, as Hildegard maintained. The local authorities disagreed with her interpretation. The interdict meant no singing of the office. The silence that descended on the community was not the great silence of the night. It was the specific silence of a community that had been singing together for decades and was now prohibited from singing. She fought the interdict. She wrote letters. The letters insisted on the spiritual importance of music, that God is praised through music, that the silence of the interdict was a form of harm to the community's spiritual life, that the angels sing, and that those who prohibited singing were cutting off the community from a form of communion with the divine. The letters won. The interdict was lifted. The community sang again. A few months later, Hildegard died. She had been fighting for the right to sing until a few months before the end. She was right about the singing. She died having won. And now sleep. Really sleep. You have been with Hildegard from the door at 14 to the death at 81. You have been with Agnes's account books and Eleanor's herb garden and Julian's argument and Marguerite Porreet's book that survived the fire and Hell's letter to Abelard that she was not supposed to write. You have been in the cold choir before dawn and the scriptorium in afternoon light and the cloister garden at evening. You have been with the women who chose and the women who didn't, the women who thrived and the women who left, the women who built institutions that lasted centuries and the women who just got through the day. They were all real. They are all here. The manuscripts are in libraries. The music is still being performed. The Abbey of St. Hildegard, rebuilt on the Rhine, is still there. The bell rings. The sisters rise. The chant continues. Sleep. Good night.